College.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today with all of you to have this amazing discussion with Dr. Janis Velasquez Farmer. And thank you to Satiko Oaks for finding and asking to bring this to our college today. And, you know, this is a really important opportunity. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Farmer here. She's known for living by her values of servant and collective leadership. And for all of us right now, as we work on our equity and inclusion efforts, I think this is an important message for us to hear. And we really appreciate that you have a lot of experience in higher ed, compassion. You are known for that. So we're really pleased that you're able to share that with us today. And that you were a first generation college graduate. And for us in community college, we really appreciate that you understand the work we do. So we're here today to learn from you. And I just want to read a little bit of something that grabbed me when I was doing research on you, Dr. Farmer. And it really spoke to me and why we need to be here and be part of what you're doing today. So I'm going to read this. It was on the USC website from a student. I just learned recently that a white man created the term model minority to describe Japanese Americans as a way of pitting them against Black Americans. Japanese Americans were terrified that they would be put in concentration camps again, and thus went through life as quietly as they could. My ancestors had to go through hell and then pretend it didn't happen. Now, Asian Americans have to deal with this term unfairly and act as a certain way, studious, quiet, smart, nerdy, or else they're looked down upon. This term and its history must be publicized so that people can be educated that its purpose is to divide people of color and pit us against each other when we should be banding together and uniting to fight our oppression. That really spoke to what you're about to talk about. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murillo, and thank you to you all for joining us. A special thank you to Dr. Byrne, who newly anointed with the fuzzy hat, I think. Just really appreciate you and Sachiko and the whole team for bringing me out. I am here in Bellingham, Washington. I have cranked my heater so that I could pretend like I'm in Santa Barbara because I'm cold. And so hopefully that fills me a little bit. So if y'all want to send some warm thoughts my way, I could definitely use them. Like I said, I'm in Bellingham, and I want to first acknowledge all of the lands in which we all occupy. For me, the land and the water and the air that nourish my body, nourish my soul, and provide for me and my family are the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. That includes the Lummi, which is right here, the Nooksack, the Semiahmoo, and the Samish. When I think about this work, I think about the fact that I am here because of violence, genocide, and the broken Treaty of Point Elliott. So it is my intent to bring awareness to this. Like, I cannot be a homeowner unless I acknowledge this violence. I also want to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and to honor the peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial. I have a whole bunch of other notes that originally I wanted to share with you right here, right at this time. And I realized that I couldn't do that without first acknowledging that I need to tell you how I'm showing up today. To give you my fullest self to the ability that I can, I have to acknowledge that I'm a little bit broken. We came out of a really troublesome weekend, which is just a pattern of troublesome times. I deeply feel the ongoing grief of not only our world and the way that it exists, but the consistent trauma as we lose more and more Black and brown bodies to violence. Our our sisters and our brothers, our aunties and our uncles, and for me, the Lolas that I've had to watch and the violence occurring against them as well. And then we still have a life to live, right? As educators, we still have to show up. So we have to leave a lot of that at the door in order to show up for others. So I share that with you because I've checked in with myself today. And I knew that in order for me to actually be my fullest self, I had to let you know that there are going to be parts of this that are really hard. We're going to talk about some really tough stuff. We're going to talk about model minority. We're going to talk about microaggressions and racial battle fatigue, and all of those things exist because of hate. We have to acknowledge that. So I'm going to ask you to just take a moment, a quiet moment, to check in with yourself. How are you showing up today, and how can you show up for others? I hope to, so, I mean, and again, initially I had a whole bunch of slides that I wanted to share. I mean, this is a model, this is a more academic presentation, but instead I'm hoping that I can have a conversation with you. So for those of you where it's available to you, or if you're willing to turn on your camera so that I can actually talk to y'all, that'd be cool. I'll let you know that also the other way that I show up is like, what you see is what you get. I don't have an on-camera presentation and an off-camera presentation. I'm gonna do my absolute best. Like, my mom's in the audience, I'm gonna check my language real quick. Also, by the way, my mom was early, y'all. She showed up in that waiting room and I was like, okay, go ahead, mom, because she was not only on time, she was early. So I'm just gonna give her a quick shout out right there. I hope to share with you a bunch of my stories. I'm gonna ask you for yours too, though. So I know that you can't chat everyone, but you can send me messages throughout. Hopefully you're gonna wait till I ask for them because that way I don't miss them. But oh, thank you for those of you who are turning on your cameras too, because it's really cool to talk to people and not boxes. We're gonna draw from some of the work of all of those. Yes, shout out to moms. I agree. I agree. But we're gonna chat today. And so as we talk about much of this work, I'm gonna first acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of some great research that happened before us. I cannot bring to you a research project on microaggressions or racial battle fatigue or even model minority without first acknowledging that this stems from Black feminist scholarship. And my goal here is not to take away from those voices, but rather to uplift them and help us all see the relevance of this work and how it applies in every social construct that we are within, right? Our everyday, our every thought, really, these social constructs have been a part of that. So I want to make sure that we understand that race relations is all based on Black scholarship. That is where we start this conversation. I've really dedicated my entire professional career. I'll share with you a little bit about my own educational journey. I've worked in universities, I've worked in the community college setting, and I currently work in K-12. I have no idea, I had no idea how like easy I had it in university settings and in the community college setting until they put me in a kindergarten classroom not too long ago. Because right now, as a director of equity in the K-12 system, you know, they're pulling us, they're asking us to sub in classrooms, and like kinders touch you a lot. So I just want to say that, like, it is kind of crazy to me that they come up and all of a sudden there's like fingers in my hair. That didn't happen when I was at the university. So I've had to learn a lot along the way. It's been, I've had to check myself lots of times because you can't be like, ooh, don't touch me, right? You shouldn't do that to a kinder. They really need that touch. So I've learned a lot in that way. And I really worked with college students that are the most marginalized by the system. That has been the fulfilling journey that I've had. And now I'm trying to get to them before they hit that point in the college system where they feel like they have to find themselves. So my goal in taking on a role like this, Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Bellingham Public Schools, was to think, what can I do to support these students so that when they get to the college, they can feel more ready? They don't feel like they have to find themselves in order to be successful in college. That for me is the exciting part about being in this role. It's also what makes this role really difficult. My imperfect path to PhD really began with the journey of those who came before me. This is my family. My mom, gorgeous, right? She came to the United States as a small child, the youngest of 9 kids. Throughout my life, I think that now I would describe her as a magician, because you got to be a magician. She walked alongside her husband, my dad, for 45 years as he battled PTSD in many different ways. She raised 3 really terrible children with really active lives. So like I have 1 kid and he has an active life, and I sometimes have no idea what I'm doing, how she did it, how they did it with 3 kids who were all just mean to each other. And while leading events for the Filipino community, I won't ever know how she did that. My dad immigrated to the United States with his mom and his white American stepfather, who had been stationed in the Philippines. He was 17 when he arrived, just in time to pick up a high school diploma from a school that he never actually attended. And then he was drafted into the Vietnam War. He rarely told stories about his experiences, but when he did, it was time to listen. We lost my dad in 2018. And so part of that brokenness that I was telling you about earlier is just knowing that that grief process for me is still happening. Grief on top of the grief that I feel for our world right now. And then the idea, like the knowing that his birthday is coming up. And so some of those pieces are really important to me. And these are the folks that came before me. I was born in San Francisco, California. I am a first generation Filipino American. I'm the middle child, only girl, Capricorn, Christmas baby. All the things going through your head right now are absolutely true. So if you think you know me, you do, you really do. You might also have already forgotten things about me, because that's what happens when you're the middle child. My mom wanted a soft and compassionate ballerina. My dad got a very stubborn, hard-headed, competitive soccer player. So that's pretty much who got what in that situation. I was a pretty great student in high school. I did all the things, and I did all the extracurricular activities. And so when it was time to graduate, we'll get to this in a little bit, but model minority really stepped in, and nobody knew that I needed help. I didn't know how to get to college, but nobody checked in with me, right? So none of the counselors were like, hey, do you know what you're doing? So everybody that I knew graduated, they went off to college, and I went to work at Circuit City. So you all know Circuit City, probably many of you. I worked at the customer service desk for a couple of years, and so I got to take those boxes and swish them down the rolly things. I need a couple, am I the only one that knows Circuit City and the rolly things? All right, I got a couple of laughs, so I feel okay, I'm feeling pretty good about that one. I made friends with my coworkers at Circuit City, and one day one of my coworkers and good friend that I had been getting in trouble with said to me hey, the cheerleaders at Highline College, they suck. So we're gonna go take them over. Do you wanna come? Okay, so now, if you are presented with an opportunity for a cheer coup, you absolutely go, right? You cannot say no to a cheer takeover. So I was like, yes, let's do this. And so I showed up to go take over the cheer squad, and apparently you have to be a student in order to participate in a cheer coup. And so legit, that's actually how I started this path. It put me on the trajectory for this educational and professional career. And navigating the college environment, though, as many of you probably know already, it takes knowledge, it takes perseverance, it takes money. And I had none of that. I had none of those things. So I flunked out of Highline College lots of times until my dad finally said, all right, do this or go, you're done. I'm not paying for anything anymore. You're on your own. And I was like, all right, so let me do this really quick. I also wanted to be an art major because that's what I did. I was an artist in college, and my parents said, nah, that's not going to work. You need to be a business major. And so I went and did that. Like, no questions asked. That's just what you do when your Asian parents say, nope, you got to do this. Right. And when they're like, going to pull everything, you just go ahead and step into that role. I'll tell you later how they ended up being right. Probably the first time my mom's ever heard me say, yeah, my mom and dad were right. I ended up transferring to a place called Western Washington University. It's in Bellingham, Washington. I'd never heard of either, but my boyfriend at Highline was going there, so I was going there, right? He flunked out before I got there, which was blessing in disguise, of course. I stayed the path, and then here in this place called Bellingham, Washington, I actually found myself as a Filipina American, as a person of color, mostly because Bellingham is super white. It's like 90% white. So even though it seems counterintuitive, maybe that I would find myself there, it really starts to make sense that I would find myself in a place that was so, I guess not, the culture was completely different, right? The equity, diversity, inclusion that I thought would exist didn't really exist in the way that helped me. And so I wanted to be a part of some of that change. I eventually, again, graduated. Probably took a little longer than it was supposed to, but I graduated with that bachelor's degree. It was the first one in my family. I had an embarrassingly low GPA, but also an embarrassingly high amount of debt. The person who walks alongside me in these pictures, my husband, he's been a first responder since we met. When I met him, he was a surf lifeguard in Hawaii, where I had moved after I graduated from college. He's currently a police officer. And so me doing this work and him doing that work, our conversations, as you can imagine, our dinner table is full. It's full with food, but it's also full of conversation. I feel like I have an influence on what he does, and he feels like he can also inform me in some of the ways that people who do work like me, sometimes we don't have that information. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything. That is certainly not the case. But it does mean that we're able to flex and move in the way that I wish was a model for more and more parts of our community. And the person I do this work for is my son. This guy's 13 years old. He is a trip. He has been in these conversations since he was born. And so every now and then, like just actually yesterday, he had to sign a code of conduct for his team, which all team members were now required to sign. And it said, you have to keep your comments, they can't be racist or sexist. And he said to me, well, they didn't say anything about LGBT. I was like, all right, well, it's time to let them know. And of course, now they're updating it to make sure it says you cannot say anti-LGBT things either. And so for him to even get there without that prompting was definitely a proud moment for me. But I also know that in this community, he's already experienced things that he shouldn't have to experience. He's been in classrooms where he's had to be the one that says, hey, what you're saying is racist. He's been the person that people have pulled their eyes up at him. And he's a mixed kid. Like, he has all the features, but like he doesn't look like some of his own friends do. And so just imagining what the environment is like when my kid has the language, but what about those kids who don't? What about the parents who don't? So I feel like I do this work for myself. I do this work for my son as he moves forward. And I do this work because I already know what they're experiencing in our K-12 system. Part of that brokenness, again, is that as I work in the K-12 system, I'm hearing some of the things that you hear in social media, which is traumatizing, but now it's coming out of 5-year-old mouths. It's coming out of 3rd grader mouths. It's coming out of 7th, 12th, it goes on. And it gets more and more impactful every single time I have to hear that there's another thing that we have to address. So I share that with you so that you know who I am. I wish that I could hear from all of you, but instead I'm going to keep talking at these boxes right here. So again, I just appreciate all the pieces that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to just pop on and off this screen every now and then because I decided that instead of having you stare at these slides, I would like to talk to you instead. I'm going to share with you a little bit about this journey that got me to a model that I call 3MBF, Model Minority Microaggressions Battle Fatigue. It really started with a conversation. So when I got on this journey, okay, so I flunked out of school a whole bunch of times and I owed a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. When I started working at Western Washington University, um, I left, moved to Hawaii, met a guy there, married him, came back to Bellingham. There was a job waiting for me at Western Washington University. So my boss had said to me at the time, like, hey, you're here, you might as well continue your education. You should get a master's degree. I was like, what's a master's degree? So he had to walk me through that process. So that mentorship was really critical for me. And after that master's degree, many years later, I decided there's more that I can do here if I just knew a little more about what was going on with students. So when I started my PhD program, I was studying the impact of first generation students who go off to college and that gap that happens. Many of you might be familiar with that gap, that strangeness feeling of the first kid who goes off to college and then has to come back and be in community with a family that may not be able to speak that same language, that might feel a distance, like all of a sudden, like, oh, you're too good for us. Maybe they don't say those words, but it comes out in many different ways, right? I wanted to study that. And then on April 17th, 2017, Dr. David Dow was forcibly removed off an airplane. The result was he was not only physically injured, but also had a concussion. I saw the video of Dr. Dow and I saw my dad, because my dad had just been diagnosed with early onset PTSD dementia. PTSD related early onset dementia. I was like, that's not right. So let me get that right. So when Dr. Dow in the video was kind of stumbling around, injured, concussed, I kind of saw what my dad was doing on a regular day. And it scared me. It really like hit me in my gut, and it scared me into a whole different way of wanting to understand the world. On social media, many of you might remember that in social media, like the whole experience really blew up. So everybody was, talking about this experience and they were upset at the airline. And one of my former students, a Black student from Western, posted on his social media, like, I'm really sorry what happened to that elder, to the uncle, but maybe now Asians will get it. And this is a student who worked with me and knew my work, had been with me for 4 years of his life, and said, maybe now Asians will get it. And so I had to take that step back, and we had a conversation, all very public, all very much social media. We went back and forth a couple of times. We got to a good place. He said, you know what? People overgeneralize. I overgeneralized. Let's change this up. And then he started sharing some information with me about, Richard Aoki and all these other ways that he could see that Asians were showing up. Because my frustration was, I'm doing this work, you might know me, but I stand on the shoulders of all of those activists, Asian activists that came before me. So we got to a good place. And again, this is very public, it's social media. The very last comment from one of my former students' friends, a Black woman, was, Asians are always the oppressors. So now I've done enough work to know I couldn't be mad at the person, but I could let the comment allow me to learn more. So my reaction to that comment was, I need to know more about what's happening right now. I need to know more about how I could feel like the work that I'm doing, especially with the students that I'm working with, the most marginalized students on a college campus, could be so invisible, could be so silenced. And so that's when I started to dig in a little bit more, and I completely changed trajectory on what I wanted to study for my dissertation. If any of you have ever changed a major before, you know exactly the feeling of anxiety that gets produced when you have to put all the work you just did aside in order to try to do something new. That's where I was, but I was determined to do it because I needed to know how in the world, what is happening in the world to allow this conversation to get to that place. Asians are the oppressors. It also meant that I had to address the fact that Asians are the oppressors. Asians can be oppressors, Asians can be oppressed, and we can be the oppressors. And how do I acknowledge that while doing this study, while doing this work? I felt like I had an obligation here, right? And so basically, I wanted to know, like for me, in doing this work for all the years that I've been doing the work, how I got silenced, how I felt invisible. So basically, middle childness, again, I wanted to study me. I wanted to know about the people just like me doing this work and if they felt the exact same way. I went into this saying to myself, okay, well, if Asian work is silenced, I'm going to go into this research saying I'm going to only use Asian researchers. I'm going to look at Asian papers. I'm going to do all this Asian stuff. And then I realized I would not have any research and I would not have any papers because only 1% of the articles published in higher ed peer-reviewed journals are even dedicated towards Asian Pacific Islander populations. So there was nothing out there. So again, I had to lean heavily and stand on the shoulders of the researchers who came before me. And if you could find a paper, it was geared towards students, which is cool and all, because I had that experience as a student too, but I needed to study me now, right? Now in this position where I'm an Asian or Pacific Islander woman in higher education, working on a predominantly white campus and not faculty. So it got a little specific, but just know this model is really built out so that it's relevant to a much broader audience. So it was, I like dove into this treasure hunt. What I did was, not after finding a good amount of information, I started this study. I looked for folks who would identify in the same way. So let me share a story here because this is kind of crazy to me. I was giving a talk a little bit about kind of some of the same stuff to another group. And I said, I wanted to study like the stereotypical Asian phenotype, and I'm thinking of myself when I say like the eye and the hair and the body. And one of the participants said, yeah, no, you're not what I picture when I picture an Asian woman. I was like, bro, who do you picture? Because to me, I look like an Asian woman, right? And so this person started describing what they believe an Asian woman looks like, and it came down to this: I'm too dark. So their stereotypical Asian woman is like China doll, maybe, like that's literally painted white. Like I don't really know, because to me, I'm like, I don't know how you look more Asian than me. But that became a big part of the conversation. Like, what is the phenotype? So I had to allow, in my study, I asked women to self-identify. I use different words just so that we're clear. Like, do you feel like you look like an Asian woman? Have you been in higher education? Are you on a predominantly white campus? And so they had to self-identify themselves into these categories so that we could get this research going. When I started this work, I ended up pulling out some major themes, and that's what led me to the model, the racial constructions model. So first, I learned that model minority stereotypes distribute across Asian and Pacific Islander women as a collective. So you have to know that there are many people who consider themselves an Asian woman who may not experience things the same way that I do. So for example, a woman from India may not feel as targeted as a woman from China. In this study, for the folks who identified themselves, and I'm thinking like targeted like right now, violence right now is going to feel a little bit different. Or there might be Pacific Islander women who don't feel targeted in the same way as Chinese women right now. So I think that was an important distinction that individuals had to make for themselves in order to opt into this research. Microaggressions were a really dominant feature of every narrative. There's also a very distinct version of racial battle fatigue, and it was specific to model minority. It could be coded to model minority-based microaggressions. And that was a really important feature of the study. And then racial battle fatigue was the result of and a contributor to hope, critical hope, the actionable hope, not the I hope it's sunny today type of hope, but like the hope that keeps you going. So we'll talk about each of those pieces individually. I'm going to ask right now that as I talk about model minority myth, if you have an experience that you might like to share, you can either throw it in the chat directly to me, or you can raise your hand and unmute and share it out loud. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to look to see if anybody has a story to share. Model minority myth exists, as I said earlier, because of hate. That hate exists because we are in a country that was developed by and on the backs of stolen African bodies. We have to know these things as we go into this conversation. Race is such a human construction. At some point, that Eurocentric allocation of value was placed on skulls, right? The shape of, the size of skulls. We have to know that going into this conversation. We have to know that then another value was placed on melanin levels. We have to know that going into this conversation. Once we had that value in place and those assessments in place, the greatest return on investment then occurs with the reinforcement of those allocations. So you begin that hierarchy. You know that you have to address that hierarchy in order to have this conversation. So if you rarely hear just those words, model minority or model minority myth in social circles, I'd like to know if you have seen or heard or felt model minority as you walk through your daily lives. And I want to address a comment, and you can raise your hand if you'd like to be with your name said out loud, so please let me know that. But I do understand that South Asians are not generalized as Asians. And so, and a lot of times we have to understand that when we say Asian as a society, we have made that a huge monolith, and that in itself is part of the frustration of the Asian name, right? And so in this place, like not only that, as a Filipina too, trying to figure out, am I Asian, am I Pacific Islander, and trying to figure out where those bloodlines come into, that was also a part of my research that we didn't get into as far as this. And as I continue in this conversation, we are post 9/11. So I really appreciate this comment. I don't mean to leave anyone out, but as we think about what's happening right now, the Asian violence that we're experiencing right now is due to what's happening specifically to coronavirus in Corona times. Coronavirus has created a very different and distinct violence that I want to make sure that we address. Please know that my goal here is not to ostracize anyone in the Asian community, but also I know where my research lives, and I can't address all the other parts, at least with any expertise. When we think about model minority as that divide and conquer strategy and that hierarchy begins to happen, it was addressed earlier when Dr. Maria was talking about the study that, or the conversation that she found online. And I think it's really important for us to understand that as we continue in this conversation, that divide, it continues to happen to this day, because the allocation of resources and the narrative itself is mostly what contributes to that divide. If I provide a narrative that says I'm holding up this particular group, it also means that I must be holding down another group. And so we have to remember that as we go through this. And having this narrative out there we have to see it as a systemic construction. I'm a systems thinker. That is my goal, is to play with strategy and systems and create systems to counter some of the systems that were set up before us. What I don't know is if we can actually undo the systems, the results and the consequences of the systems that came before us. These systems were built intentionally. The hierarchy was built intentionally. I want us all to know that and see how it was done. Specific to the Asian experience, you can see, if you go back a little bit, not even that far, go back a little bit in history, and you can see how this hierarchy played out. Not only was model minority developed by a white man, the term by a white man, but it is white men who created the policies that would then create this, that would allow us to develop and perpetuate this story. Let's think Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. This prohibited Chinese immigration, but that was also built on the back of the Page Act of 1875. So Chinese women were excluded from immigration, right? So we knew that we needed the labor. We knew that we didn't need any attachments to that labor. The Immigration Act of 1924 included the Asian Exclusion Act and the National Origins Act. So this included the Asiatic Barred Zone, which limited immigration from Asia, except Japan, who voluntarily did not want to immigrate, and the Philippines, that was already colonized and was a US colony. Quick story, when I took my son to New York a couple of years ago, we were at Ellis Island. Now my son is half Italian, so he has great grandparents whose names are on the wall at Ellis Island. There's also a little kiosk that you could type on, you can punch some buttons and you can determine, it tells you if you would have been admitted at Ellis Island. Seems like now that I think about it, in the aftermath, I'm like, why did I let my son play with that game? But he found out that he would have been denied. Why? Because in that time, he would not have been allowed in because of Asian exclusion. That became a whole conversation on the ferry ride back. And when we were there with our friends, like we all had to have that conversation about it. And so really wanting to understand and have my child understand that even though he's half Asian or Filipino, he would not have been allowed to immigrate at that time. So during the same time period, immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Poland totaled over 30,000. And additional laws allowed European men to bring their wives in as non-quota immigrants. So if you were from Europe, you could bring your family. If you were from Asia, you could come, but only as a laborer, and you could not bring your family. Naturalization laws were reserved for specifically white immigrants, which affected citizenship, suffrage, and land ownership. So now we start this process of allocation of resources, right? So again, this is a human constructed systemic design. When we start thinking model minority, we have to think about the fact that if our Japanese Americans could overcome their discrimination and achieve social and economic success, and they must be a model. Never mind the fact that we've now created this very large Asian category. So if there was any success, they are all lumped together. Mind you, we still do this in education. So while this is historical, we have to apply it to what we do presently. I can tell you how Asians in my school district are faring grade-wise, and then it looks very different than if you break down each individual ethnic identity, right? You all know that too. Education is very similar across the board. In 1965, the act was amended to refocus the policy on family reunification. So now, in order to attract skilled labor, you could also then send for their families. So what does that mean? It means that when you bring in your families, they're here knowing that they're here to work. Your husband is here to work, and therefore, as the wife, what do I need to do to ensure my husband's success at work? So if we think about that, that is how we start thinking about that assimilative piece, that the Asian woman has to be silent and allow the things to happen in order for her to feel like her gratitude here makes sense. I'm grateful just to be here. This sends a message. So let's think. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We have Executive Order 9066. During the Korean War, the Emergency Detention Act passed. And that was, it authorized the establishment of more concentration camps for domestic threats. What does that mean? It means that we all become more and more silent. Politically silent, socially silent. It sends a message that We know that what happened with Japanese internment is easily replicable. And it means that as you bring, like, so my family, right? You have a white military base in, you have a military base, American military base in the Philippines. You can marry a woman there and you can bring her family back here non-quota. What does that say about the family unit then? Well, you must be grateful to be here. We're allowing you to be here. Again, you need to assimilate to this culture. You need to be silenced. You need to understand how we operate here. And it definitely means that that domestication piece is very specific. We're writing the script for you. Your job is to fall in line. There are many other ways that quotas and pathways to immigration existed. So these are just little bits and pieces of them. I want to share a couple of pieces that for one person in our audience today, it says, my parents were college educated immigrants. Growing up, they had difficulty navigating the US educational system for me. And because of the model minority myth, no one mentored, supported, or guided me. And so I struggled alone for years and years. And I want to say that hits home for me. And that's where model minority really starts to showcase how traumatic and stressful these stories are on the backs of our Asian children. When you are left out and you don't know what questions to ask, when there's an assumption made and you're not quite sure how to navigate the system, that's an allocation of resources that are given to others that are not given to Asian students because of that narrative, because of that story. So let's go with microaggressions. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's a fun topic, right? We understand microaggressions. You can start throwing your microaggressions in the chat. Remember to chat me directly if you want me to be able to see that. Microaggressions can be described as those everyday little slights. It can also be described as the feelings you get when individuals, they can be like, I guess what I'm saying is they can be blatant, they can be in your face, and sometimes it's just simply being left out. So in my experience here, I was meeting some friends, some coworkers actually at a coffee shop across from our college. I'd been standing in line for a good 2 minutes or so. My white friend and coworker walks up behind me and immediately was asked, "Can I help you?" And the feeling of absolute invisibility like hit hard in that moment, because then you have folks who are like, well, maybe that's just bad customer service. Well, it was bad customer service one time. It's not bad customer service anymore, right? And so it takes the person who just walked up behind you to say, actually, she was here first. But how often does that even happen? When my son walks this community with me, he knows we're going to get different service than when he walks the community with his dad. We know that. He's even pointed some of those pieces out. Microaggressions take the form, microaggressions take this form. And as we talk through microaggressions, knowing that this is, again, research that is standing on the backs of many great researchers, and most recently, collaborative efforts from Daryl Wing Su and many of his researchers have brought microaggressions back into our almost daily vernacular. It's really here at microaggressions that you see that there's different categories and how they tend to pop up. Micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. Micro assaults, again, being those very obvious, blatant, those are the things that are said. That's getting missed in the line. That is somebody saying something about you, right? Or insulting you. Same thing. It's pretty blatant. It's in your face. And it's the micro invalidations that tends to require a little more explanation on how it feels. That's someone saying something that you just said in a meeting, but since they are a white woman, they got heard and everybody appreciates that comment. That's you doing this work constantly, and then somebody else getting credit for a little piece that they contributed to. I'm getting a highlight in the newsletter, right? That's the even just feeling gaslighted. I can sit here and have this conversation all day long and still someone's going to feel like I did not tell them enough. But I didn't go into detail on this. I mean, I only have like 90 minutes with y'all, but I can talk about this stuff all day long. So when I pick and choose, you have to know that there's probably more information there, but we're going to try to have a fuller conversation today by just addressing these pieces. Nobody's thinking about that though. She didn't talk about this, so she does not know what she's talking about. So my microaggressions here though, I add the model minority myth to it. So when you see a model, you're going to see racial microaggressions, micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations, but you're not going to usually see a model minority put over that. And I did that here because in my study, many of the microaggressions that these women talked about, that the women who look like me talked about, had specifically ties to this model minority narrative. So think about that for a moment and feel free to share with me in the chat how any of this fits your perceptions of this conversation. If you have any experiences with this, understanding how the model minority myth then creates those systemic environmental microaggressions. So now I'm seeing how representation in media matters. Now I'm understanding that when I see an Asian person on the screen, now I get excited about that, but also that Asian person is still fitting a very specific stereotype. Those environmental pieces do not allow us to remove ourselves from that narrative. It's an important part of how we address this conversation. We'll move forward into racial battle fatigue. This is an exciting one because the research that I did to learn about racial battle fatigue, I was excited to reach out to the researcher and get a response and made me feel like, oh, cool. Also, I felt like I met someone famous, so that was pretty awesome. If you've never heard of racial battle fatigue, here's the best way I can explain it. Imagine the last time you were in an interview, all that anxiety, like just think on it for a moment, like all that anxiety, the like high stress moments, your body like might be kind of sweaty even though you're cold, feeling like you're just on all the time during that interview. Everything that you say or do, people are judging you. People are going to pinpoint all the little things. They're going to write it down on their papers. I know, I just did a whole bunch, right? And they're going to talk about you afterwards. There's so much anxiety and stress that comes along with that interview. And racial battle fatigue is that feeling all the time. You get to leave that interview. You get to walk out the door and be like, racial battle fatigue, you don't get to leave the interview. You're in it. And imagine if you were in interview mode all the time, what kind of impact that has on your body, on your psyche. All the pieces are there. You're feeling like, oh man, if you ever blown an interview, you're like, that feeling of like, oh, I blew it, right? But eventually that subsides. When you have a little bit of fear in your body because you see a bear or a bobcat, those things are in my backyard. But that fear subsides eventually. When you have to think back on that interview and now you've gone through all the different steps, the things that you tried to do right, or you know what you missed. Oh, I should have said this. But that feeling eventually subsides for you. In racial battle fatigue, it doesn't subside. You don't get to walk away from it. You don't get a redo. And so these pieces were such an important part of understanding how women who look like me were experiencing their jobs in this environment on a predominantly white campus, but again, specific to model minority. I had women who told me that they were learning about their digestive system failures because of all of this. I had women who couldn't sleep. Their sleep patterns were off. I had women who were having difficulty getting pregnant. I've talked to friends and their autoimmune disorders were starting to come in during these times when they were in the most highest stress because of model minority-based racism. In their stories, I was able to code that out of what they were saying. People didn't say to me, oh, you know, I'm experiencing racial battle fatigue because of model minority microaggressions today. They didn't say that. So I just need you to know, like, this is a lot of pulling and culminating these stories to get here. Because eventually we get to this piece. Hopefully this looks familiar because I love the Hunger Games. I love those movies, but I want to tell you another story. I love this part of this movie because what he says is, hope is greater than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. And I share this one specifically because one time for one of my doctoral classes, I had to write an introduction about myself to my class. And so I put in all the good stuff I thought, right? So as my personal testament, I said that I was athletic and strong, and I was a survivor. I was survivalist and disciplined, self-reliant, and I was very proud of it. And I handed that introduction of myself to my mom. She read it, and she handed it back to me, and she said, "You forgot love and hope." And that hit me in a way that just that feeling right here in my gut one more time, right? Because I had forgotten love and hope. And so this, for me, a little hope is effective, a lot of hope is dangerous, really started to play into the way I wanted to continue on this journey in this research that I was doing. I wanted to know, first of all, why I missed it. So here's what I came up with. Hope, if you research just hope, the critical elements are agency, pathways, and external forces. Now, I've been doing a lot of work in social justice for a long time. So I know through my studies, especially with students, that critical elements of social justice work is that self-efficacy piece, understanding outcomes, and even the spiritual orientations. When I put those two things side by side, I noticed that critical hope, that action-oriented hope, the pieces that get you moving could be pulled from these two pieces. So if you are engaged in social justice, you are engaged in hope all of the time. So critical hope is the action. And that's why what you'll see here is this model. That's why what I think happens, this is my idea of how we can understand the most basic part of this social construction. Because we are committed to social justice, we are going to experience racial battle fatigue because critical hope will keep us moving. Even when we're tired, critical hope is going to keep us moving, which keeps us in a loop with racial battle fatigue. Our bodies might be failing us, but critical hope is going to keep us moving, which then keeps us in a loop with racial battle fatigue. On the far right, you're also going to notice that this whole cyclical part of racial battle fatigue and critical hope is directly connected to the model minority stereotypes. Because we have these ideas that assimilation and all of those internalized oppressions and the expectations of everyone around us are going to feed into this cycle. And the microaggressions that we are experiencing, the micro assaults, the micro insults, and those micro invalidations are leading into that cycle of racial battle fatigue and critical hope. So I've tied all of these pieces together specific to the experience of women like me doing this work, especially in higher education and especially on predominantly white institutions. This was the same model that seemed to fit every narrative of all of the women that I talked to for this study. And so I'm gonna eventually take this slide down. and I want to see your faces again. And I want to read through your comments, but I have just a couple of last things that I want to share with you. I was once interviewed for another doctoral student's research and dissertation work. And one of the questions that I was asked is, what do you think the American dream is? So I thought on that for a quick second because, I grew up in the United States. I know what the American dream is. You got that white picket fence and the ability to participate in capitalist enterprise. You probably have like a kid and a half and a dog. I was there. And then my ancestors tapped me on the shoulder. And I hear the voice of my dad in the background, and he was like, "Girl, really?" So I had to take a step back. So I'm going to give you my Filipinoized version of the American dream. I reflect on my grandparents who pursued American citizenship for promise of a land derived from a library of false narratives. Colonization of Filipino ancestral lands. Try that one more time. Colonization of Filipino ancestral lands obliterated much of the indigenous way of life, territorialized common and shared lands, and poisoned Filipino communities until each body reeked of greed. Colonial mentality embedded within them the ideological society where they were free to roam, free to participate, and free to engage in a community within, of course, the confines of colonial governance. Both sides of my family were given immigration privileges based on the US military occupation of their homeland. Yet, stories about America prevailed, and the offer to immigrate was one that was far too good to pass up. My mom's father served in the Philippine Army and worked alongside US soldiers in World War II. He was a survivor of the Bataan Death March. The Death March, which was a war crime, included 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war based on the Japanese invasion, which began the day after Pearl Harbor. Prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles, and thousands died during this march. My grandfather's commitment and servitude earned him immigration privileges outside of the quotas and immigration laws. My grandmother on my dad's side must have believed in something special. She married a white American soldier who was stationed in Manila, and they were able to bring their family back to the United States, again, outside of quotas and immigration laws. As I told you earlier, my dad arrived here, picked up that high school diploma, and was drafted into the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, my dad earned 2 Purple Hearts before he was honorably discharged from his duties as both a long-range reconnaissance patrol and an Army Ranger. He served on the front lines of Vietnam. His body was used in 6-man teams for recon, sometimes given orders to engage Vietnamese enemies. He trained with white, black, and brown soldiers, developing an independent lifeline for survival. It was just them out in the jungle. However, for most people, especially the young, white, black, and brown drafted soldiers, they had not had enough experiences with various Asian ethnicities to be able to differentiate him from the Viet Cong if he was in civilian clothes. So his rare storytelling moments, they started to consume me. One of them is that once he was asked, how he could help with a training, they grabbed him by the shoulder and they pranced him around in front of all the other soldiers and said, "If you see this face out there, shoot." More than one time, he had to hide on his own base because other drunk soldiers thought he looked like the enemy and pulled guns on him repeatedly. He had to reconcile with his own image in the mirror because he was trained to shoot anyone who looked like him. When he excitedly returned to his new country, even though he had just been discharged with another Purple Heart, he was spit on, had bottles thrown at him, and was targeted for his association with an unpopular war, and because he's a brown body, right? My dad is a dark brown Asian man. For me, the stories here aren't just historical, they're genealogical. The stories and the impacts of these experiences are embedded in my DNA. They feed my strategies, my values, and my mission. I honor my ancestors' pursuit and stand tall on their shoulders as I define, commit to, and achieve this dream. So here's my answer. For my family, the American dream is one of influence and contribution. For me, for my family, and for my ancestors, I am the American dream. As a brown Asian woman, I work tirelessly against the current of dominant patriarchal systems. I must often choose between my soul and the system. As a woman of color, we rarely feel like we can get one step ahead because the path is never open to us. We experience a glass ceiling and a glass cubicle, watching others around us rise, take our credit, and even receive our paychecks. Our work is never done. At the intersection of racialized and gendered identities, we can never just step away from this work. We never get to blend in. And even when we are at the point of exhaustion, a racial slur, a microaggression, an oversight, a silencing, a whitewashing of cultural history snaps us back to our feet. Our work is never done. Daily, I trudge through systems with survival tactics, code switching to overcome the daily traumas of silenced voices, production stagnation, stifling of leadership abilities, and the continuance of a cycle of inequality and inequity. I display my own vulnerability, my humanness for the benefit of everybody around me, giving them the space to explore their identities and their systemic privileges. We create this space for curiosity and inquiry, all within the confines of false narratives, because we live in such a liberal community. We are creative negotiators. We see opportunities invisible to others and present systems altering innovations from the whispers. Yeah, we whisper to each other because we are the army of thinkers and doers. We're patient. Sometimes, we're patient sometimes. We strategically navigate social constructions and prioritize policy and procedure focal points in terms of relationships, acknowledging the complex interconnectedness of all things. Our leadership trajectory involves diverse challenges, indirect forays, and ventures into foreign territory rather than getting that straight line to the top. It's like solving a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded and navigating an invisible labyrinth with walls that you can't even see while competing in the amazing race. We do that. We stay in this work despite the overwhelming trauma endured day after day, knowing that as we stand on the shoulders of the mighty women who came before us, we know that one day we're going to hold up the women who follow. So let's be dangerous with our critical hope. I want to take a moment and just say thank you. I really did mean to get to a whole lot more questions and stuff, so I'm going to do that now. Let me run through some of the things that are in the chat, and then if you have questions, please send them over so that we can get to them. I've got the American dream as a bait and switch for the majority of people of color. And they did, they sold it, right? This idea that we, my computer is verifying Microsoft Outlook right now and it's scaring me because I hope it doesn't, okay, it didn't kick me off. Ooh. Imagine the idea that we have sold to so many people that this is the place to be. And then when you get here, it's a whole another ballgame. You don't have to imagine it though, because that's where we live. That's where we stay right now. We have to keep that in mind. We have microaggressions wondering if every comment you make is seen as being submissive. The tiger mom, the dragon lady, the inscrutable Asian. It's exhausting. Also knowing that I will never be seen as the angry Asian lady in the same way that my colleagues who are Black women will be seen as the angry Black woman. I have to own that within myself, right? In order for me to do this work. I can say things that I know my colleagues can't, and also I know how I'm received. So while I can say something for somebody else, if that's the relationship that we have, I also know that it's so easy to gaslight me in these areas. But when we work together, when we pull our words together, when we pull each other up together, that's where we start to make these changes. The system will continue the way it is until we decide to come together to do this work. When I think about the reason for me doing this social construction, it is not to maintain that perpetual storyline. It's to ensure that we get to work together. It's to ensure that we see how this model minority idea is a separative, divisive, hate influenced idea, instead of thinking, how do we keep coming together? We have to build systems that are going to change that up. Never having an Asian teacher in my entire life except in a language class. I have a high school diploma. I have an Associate of Arts transfer degree. I have an adult and higher education master's degree. I have an organizational development master's degree and a PhD in human development. I've had one Asian teacher. I've had 0 Black teachers. I wish I could hear you all right now. I feel like I'm talking to myself. Is there a way out of the model minority myth? It seems that through our commitment, hold on, I'm getting lots of messages and my computer's about to die. Okay. Is there a way out of the model minority myth? It seems that through our commitment to change and justice, our critical hope, we unwittingly reinforce the myth and end up back in the cycle. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did, because I wish I could say, yeah, there's totally a way out, and here's how you do it. Here's what we have to do, and give you the step-by-step instructions. But just like having a kid, there's no instructions for that, right? So we have to really think through, what are the things that we might want to do? What can we accomplish together that can at least shift the myth, shift the narrative? And the way that we do that is by bringing communities together. How have we as a community, as a very large Asian community, addressed our anti-Blackness? Because when we do that, we're more likely to be able to reach out and say to our brothers and sisters, hey, we got your back with this. How do we demonstrate that over and over and over until that feeling of mutual respect exists? Because our communities are so separated by a system that was built very, very well. I understand systems because I've studied it, because I love systems. And that's the reason why I can see how well the system was built for us. And I can see how well we fit into it with all of our work. Until we all can see that, we can't change systems. Until we all understand that we were put in this position because policies put us here, we can't change systems. So there's lots of opportunities for us, but we got to put in the work. Just put in a lot of work. I see that Emma Cruz has a question. I'd love to hear your voice, Emma.
Hi, Dr. Janis. I'm sorry I'm not on video. I'm off today, so you definitely don't want to see me right now because I look like a mess. I just wanted to thank you because I'm actually first generation Mexican American, and your story was very, very similar. Our high school mentality was mostly like, let's just get them through high school. There was a lot of us, and we were never, included in the messaging about the SATs, the PSATs, or any of that. And I wasn't a bad student. I was like a B student, but still it was just the mentality that they had. Unfortunately, at home, we didn't have the same support because we were first generation Mexican. It was very much, you stay home, you don't go anywhere. So I don't know what the whole concept would have been if we would have gone off to school. So we did like local community college, then we got a job, and that's kind of where we stayed. And here I am at, 51 now, trying to finish up, get my AA and prove to my daughters who are absolutely amazing. I have 2 amazing daughters, that, you know, that even at 51, you can still do it. So just your story is absolutely amazing, and it's very inspiring, and hopefully more people can actually listen to what you're saying, because it's exactly what like I went through in high school. Like my counselor let me take an ESL science class so that it would be easy for me to do it. And I'm like, you're a teenager, of course you're gonna go, yeah, I'll take it. You know, of course I aced it because, you know, it was an ESL, and I've never been in ESL. I was born and raised here. I'm fluent, and, you know, but she just plopped me in there just so that I can just get an easy A. I mean, like, a counselor shouldn't be doing that. That's just wrong. You know, but I'm glad that, you know, you're here and you're doing this. I think this is amazing. So thank you so much for all you do. And you sound like your son is going to be like just this amazing kid. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my kid might be amazing. He kind of drives me crazy sometimes, but I really appreciate it. I'll let him know that you gave him a shout out. Maybe that'll get him, because, you know, they listen to other people, not really.
Oh yeah, they won't listen to you. Yeah. I have a daughter who graduated with her BFA in musical theater, so she's paving the way for the Latinas to go into Broadway. So we're really excited about that, because you know, she's playing roles that would have never, and she's fighting it right now a lot too, because, you know, nowhere does it say that Cinderella is white. Nowhere in the story does it say Cinderella is white. So that's the kind of stereotype that she's having to fight, because when people are cast by a certain, you know, there's this outcry of like, why does, you know, well, like the Little Mermaid show that's going to come out, why is a Little Mermaid black? Like, she's not supposed to be black. Never does it say in the story that she's not black. So that's I'm really proud of her for doing that too. So thank you.
Great points. Thank you so much. Those are big points, because even when we say in a story that the character is a person of color, we still see it on screen as a white cast member. We see it on stage as a white cast member. And I think that's really critical too, because it's not that there was a lot in there. I mean, I think that you all heard those words. I think those are really powerful words. And I appreciate you sharing. I was like one of a small handful of students of color in general at my high school. And I think that also contributed to the way model minority plays out, because if there was like 3 Asians and maybe 4 Black students, you know, obviously the Asians don't need any help, you know, and not all of us came from these backgrounds where we had we didn't have tutors, private tutors, we didn't have all this stuff. And so I just think it's really important for us to realize that now that I work in the K-12 system, I'm trying to also look at how our systems are set up to consistently perpetuate that story. I also want to point out there's one really great comment that I received, and it's that we're not silent, we're just not heard. And that's huge. So thinking about the idea that the silencing is happening to us, not that we ourselves don't have any thoughts. We always got stuff to say. Y'all know we got stuff to say, right? Get us in a room together and you can't get everybody to shut up. We got stuff to say, but it doesn't mean that it gets heard. And I think that is such a critical and important point. This person has to repeat themselves 4 times and then be backed by a bystander in order to get that comment heard. Absolutely. And if you see that happening, be the bystander. When I can see that my coworker over here is not being heard, I can be that bystander. Or if that comment gets repeated by somebody else, I'm happy to say, actually, she just said that. We have to be those people in the room. We have to have that feeling that we can reach out to each other, whether physically, eye contact, or just that knowing, I got you. Hong, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question, and I know your mom is here, so I know it might get you in trouble. But I grew, my situation. I am the first generation child of both people that came from Vietnam. You know, I'm of Chinese descent, but from Vietnam. So I grew up. By the time I was in 4th grade, I had 2 Asian teachers. My class was 60-70% Asian. So the circumstances are different, but the pressure is still there, but from different sources. So my source of model minority oppression and all this stuff was from my parents. You know, like my parents use those tools to push against me and keep me. I mean, when you talk to Asian parents about this, they'll say the results speak for themselves. The results are good. But the mental trauma and the anguish that the kids go through and all this, is it really necessary? I don't know how much academically has been done exploring the idea of like the Asian parents as these perpetrators of this like microaggressive violence. But I would I mean, I'm curious if you've seen anything, because like if it doesn't come from one place, it comes from another. If you grew up in one situation, it comes from here. If you grow up from here, that. So in my personal situation, it came from my parents, and they'll always say the results speak for themselves. The results are good, but the path to get those results was unbelievably unnecessary, in my opinion. So I don't know if there's any kind of like conversation about that happening, but there's a lot of trauma and impact there. There's a lot of conversations that I'm happy we can have today as, older folks, older first generation folks, and for young folks today, they can have those conversations with their parents that I absolutely could not speak about at all to my parents, because their path was so fraught. Their path was so difficult. Their grind was 8 times more dangerous than my grind. They were literally having guns pulled at them in their mother country, and they're literally being stomped on in this country, and they did it. But at the same time, there's a lot for me to still unpack today, and I just, it's just one of those things where no matter where you are, it'll come for you. And I feel like as long as we can speak on it, and like I'm having this conversation with you, I still haven't been able to talk to my parents about this stuff. Like my dad was in the army in Vietnam. I still don't know which army he was in because he won't talk about it. So yeah. There's just a lot there. But I just do want to thank you for taking the time, and you've really opened up a lot of minds here today, mine as well. So thank you for that. And just, I guess it's not as much of a question, it's more of a rant, but thank you.
I love the rant. Let me address some of that real quick, because I think that's cool. And I love that my mom is here, because we've had some of these conversations as well. And I want to start this, that every single situation is going to have its own story. So I want to share with you some of my things that I've uncovered in this work. And a lot of this was also uncovered while my dad had dementia and eventually passed right before I got my doctoral degree. So it's something that like I've been processing, and I still continue to process. A couple of years ago, actually just like 1 or 2 years before my dad was diagnosed, he had come up to Bellingham because my son's school was having a Veterans Day assembly, and they were early. Imagine that. My mom was early today and they were early then. So maybe I should be rethinking this whole pattern. Anyway, so they came and visited me at the college I was working at, and just happened to run into, just happened to be that our veterans director was also in my office. And later on that day after the assembly, my parents left, my family left, I ran into that director again, and he said to me, I have been telling everyone that your dad was a LERP. I got to meet a real life LERP today. And I was like, what? Like literally my face like this, huh? What are you talking about? And he said, you don't know that your dad was a LERP? And I was like, I don't even know what a LERP is. What does that mean? So he said, you have to look up long range reconnaissance patrol. He said, basically, your dad's a badass. And if you were to take him today and put him back in that jungle, he could probably still do everything that he was trained to do. And I said to him, that is the scariest thing that anybody's ever said to me. Right? So here's what I've uncovered from that conversation moving forward. I think that many of our parents in that generation, the immigration generation, if you're first gen or second gen, there's a level of survival that we really have to understand. I believe at this point in time that my dad did not want any of us kids, 3 of us terrible, terrible kids growing up, to have an accent, because he knew that would increase our chances at success. That also means that while he's in survival mode, and my mom was also told, remember, youngest of 9 kids when they immigrated, her dad told her, none of you speak Tagalog anymore, now you speak English, when they immigrated. Now why? Both families are here because of military influence. So keep that in mind, that survival mode is real. And if they can find any way for us, our generations, their kids to survive, it is do this, do this, do this, do this, keep your head down. And that way you become less of a target. If I know right now that people with accents feel like people treat them differently, act like they're stupid because they have an accent, I know that what my dad did for me was the opposite of that. So now I have different indicators. My English is very good. When people compliment me, I'm like, yeah, that's cool, like K-12 system right there, right? Because I only speak English. But that's a loss of culture for me. My mom is now fluent in Tagalog. She learned at like, what, 40? She's nodding. Okay, so she learned the language because she told her friends, I really want to learn Tagalog. They stopped talking to her in English. They wouldn't even answer her if she asked a question in English. Like, you got to have your people that understand that for you. And for us ourselves, like I just had a speaker come in and talk to my district this week. A former student at Western came in and said, you know, he went back to China to find his roots. He learned the language and was immersed in it and now knows his language better than his grandparents did. I haven't had that opportunity, but understanding that for our parents, it was survival. For us, it's loss of culture. What are we going to do about it? I try to teach my child as much as I possibly can, knowing that it's from a place that I've already been disconnected from culture because of survival. There's much more to that and a whole lot more than we can uncover in the next 4 minutes. But for me, that's my answer. Yes, absolutely model minority. Yes, it was do your absolute best. The A- was never good enough for me and my family. It was the A. Scoring 3 goals on the field was not enough. Why didn't you score that 4th one? Why'd you miss? You know, it was always those pieces to push harder and harder. And I think that came from that element of we're here to survive. We're trying to survive. Every moment of our lives, we're trying to survive. My dad had to survive in the jungle. My mom had to survive as she was brought here as a young child and told she cannot speak her language. So for all of us, all of these elements really tie into that for me.
Thank you. Roxanne, did you still want me to unmute? I'm going to give you the unmute prompt. And then I also want to mention your point about Asians being oppressors. I have 2 older sisters, so I've felt that to my soul. So sorry. Okay, Roxanne, thank you.
Well, I felt the A- is not good enough to my soul. I mean, I remember coming home with report cards with an A-, and it was like, what happened to the A?
Uh-huh.
Why are you failing?
Uh-huh.
And so absolutely, you know, Hong, what you're talking about, that how that's perpetuated in the home, I think is really profound. I was the person who made the comment about having, you know, 2 parents who were college educated and still experiencing educational trauma in this system. You know, my dad came from Iran and my mom came from Japan. They both came here for college and met each other and then tried to blend this family, assimilate to, you know, quote unquote, American culture, figure out what our home culture would be with these 2 very distinct, you know, cultures within them. And, you know, what I think back on so much is how my parents, despite being college educated individuals, didn't know how to navigate the system in the US. They didn't understand what the expectations were of them. I remember my mom being so mortified and ashamed and worried when the school would contact her for like a parent-teacher conference, right? She just didn't really understand what is going to happen. Am I being admonished? Am I doing something wrong? And I remember in high school, you know, I was that straight A student all the way through. And then in high school, I kind of fell off. I actually dropped out of high school. I didn't graduate normally. And that was because by that time, I think she just didn't know how to navigate or support me anymore. And nobody at the school did either, because I was the model minority. I was just someone who's supposed to make it. And there was other individuals that all that focus and attention was on. And Asian students at my school were very, very, you know, it was just a small group of students. So I think that we kind of got lost in the shuffle in many ways. And I think about that even moving into, you know, when I ended up at community college, same thing, right? The resources available to me as an Asian student were not there. Nobody really paid attention to this person who had the potential, like everyone does, but didn't have the resources, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have. And so I think that that's really profound to me. And when I sit ourselves in our DEI meetings and other spaces on our campus, I feel so frustrated when Asian students get overlooked and the Asian experience gets overlooked because it feels so familiar. Yeah. So I think that that's something that I hope out of this conversation at our campus, we can really begin to think about, like, what are the ways that we perhaps are overlooking a group of students or a group of individuals, and how are we continuing to microaggress them by eliminating them from the conversation? And so I think that that's, you know, that I want to just thank you, Janis, for coming and talking to us today, because it is also a topic that we don't talk about at Santa Barbara City College. You know, it's such a small percentage of our population. I think we have fully aggregate data. We don't disaggregate anything. So we don't really know how our Asian students are doing. And I think that hopefully this is a beginning for us to start thinking about this student population, how we can serve them better.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for just your time today. If I could just take one more minute, I know that we're just out of time. I want to share a couple of notes from the chat since you all can't see the rest of the chat. One person said, I lost my native language at 4 years old when I came to the US. It was imperative that we assimilate immediately as my white military father dropped us off in a new land and then left to fight the war. I think that's a big one. Our students will really benefit from your story of the American dream. Thank you so much for that comment. And it's definitely one that I have had to think on, right? And so when your immediate response is like, yeah, I know exactly what the American dream is. It's the kid and a half or something like that, a dog, a house, a fence, all that stuff. And then I realized that that's not me. That's not my world. That's not the way that I want my dream to operate. Model minority keeps us in the servitude of perennially being grateful for being here. Survival, right? All these comments are just adding more and more flavor to the way that this model helps us understand race relations and the construct of being a person in this country. That's really, really critical to understand. Critiques can be seen as unpatriotic. We don't want to continue to be there, but we know we have to continue to use our voices. Our voices are so critical. And again, when we reach across and we pull everyone together, we're going to realize that we have a lot more in common with our brothers and sisters of all different ethnicities and races than we currently think that we do, than we're being led to believe that we do. Those are really big pieces. Thank you so much. I know that I'm over just a little bit. One more time, I want to give a shout out that I stand on the shoulders of my mom, who is an activist at her city college in San Francisco. Also during the time the International Hotel was being protested and riots were happening, and what a great opportunity to highlight just some of the work that she did and how crazy she might have been in her college days, and give her that shout out right there. So thank you all, and I'll hand it over to Sachko or Hong or anybody else.
Yeah.
Who wants to close out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janis Velasquez Farmer, sorry. Thank you for the powerful and insightful presentation and conversation. And I want to thank Roxanne for introducing us to Janis. I had to turn off the camera for a couple times because I was crying. It was very touching, and thank you so much for all of you who showed up today, and I hope this was meaningful to all of you, and hope to continue the conversation on campus. Thank you so much again.
If folks in the AAPI plus ERG could stay on for a few minutes after the meeting, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend.